1992 in August. And it was really not a sincere idea. What happened is in August of 1992, we started for the first time getting very concrete evidence of mass killings, concentration camps, rape camps. And there was some, and it mostly came from journalists, but I actually managed to get a hold of some internal UN papers that showed that even the UN knew that this was going on. So we started asking the UN and started asking the major powers at the UN Security Council, why aren't you letting the world know that these things are happening in Bosnia, that people are being held in concentration camps, many being killed, but others just being starved to death, and that there are what we call now ethnic cleansing, that there are people either being forced from their homes or being murdered if they don't leave. And the response of the UN officials, the highest officials at that time, including a Brit who was working in the Secretariat offices, well, we let those know, we made it public to those who should know, which meant they told Washington and London and Paris, but they didn't even let the other UN members, even the other UN Security Council non-permanent members know. So they were trying to hide the reality in order to decrease the pressure for intervention. Once this information came out, then there was again a pressure for intervention or something to be done. So they did two things. They said, oh, okay, well, we're going to have a court. We're going to establish a court that's going to bring all the bad guys to justice. And what this really was meant to be is like, well, maybe we won't do anything today, but in order for all of us to feel good about ourselves, including US citizens and British citizens and others, we're going to promise that we're going to punish the bad guys like we punished the Nazis. Well, as we know, actually, we could have stopped the Nazis from killing so many Jews and others. We could have done it. But we chose not to for whatever reason. So, the next best thing that they thought at that time was, okay, let's promise justice. So let's establish a committee, a commission of experts, as it was called, to study the idea of establishing a war crimes tribunal. The other thing that they did was they actually said, oh, okay, we're going to have another conference. It's going to be called the London Conference. It's going to be in a couple of weeks in London. And with some of my relationships with some of my Serb counterparts at that time, I found out that actually Francois Mitterrand called John Major at the urging of some of the Serbian officials at that time and said, we've got to do something, let's hold a conference in London, because if we're holding a peace conference in London, that means there'll be some hope held out that there'll be a negotiated settlement and there'll be less pressure for some sort of military intervention. So of course there was a London conference. Of course all sorts of promises were made, promises that should have delivered peace 4 or 5 months after the war started, but of course none of those promises were kept. None of them were kept from Milosevic, who was the Serbian president, or from the powers who were going to guarantee Milosevic's performance. In the end, the War Crimes Tribunal was supposed to also fade away. And there were actually 3 people who I think played an instrumental role in having the tribunal happen. One of them is a professor of law named Sharif Bassioni. He teaches at DePaul. He's naturalized Egyptian, US citizen, married to a Jew, who actually wouldn't let go of the evidence and the idea of a war crimes tribunal. At that time, there was some idea that the world, the globe, needed an international criminal court. So this was kind of seen as aligning itself with that. The second person that was very sympathetic to this view was Madeleine Albright, then my counterpart as UN ambassador. So in 1993, Madeleine and I had a disagreement, or more accurately, I, as the representative of Bosnia, had a disagreement with Washington on some policy, and part of the compromise was that the U.S. in fact would support an immediate establishment of the War Crimes Tribunal. And that happened by UN resolution a year after the commission was set up in the late spring of 1993. So the third person I consider to be responsible for establishing the International Criminal Tribunal is me. I never judged a case. I was a witness a couple of times, but it changed the course of history. It changed the course of history not only in Bosnia, and frankly in Bosnia I think it has had mixed results, and I don't need to get into that. But then there was an inevitable momentum to establish the International Criminal Court. And we had all sorts of meetings and conferences until 1998, in the summer of 1998. We met in Rome for a couple of months debating what the International Criminal Court should look like. And under Bill Clinton, there was some idea the U.S. might sign the agreement, might join sometime later on. Under President George W. Bush, it worked against it. But at that time, the U.S. was a little bit more supportive. And lo and behold, at the end of a couple of months of negotiations, we actually ended up putting together a treaty called the Rome Treaty, which established the International Criminal Court. Bosnia, and I, as the head of its delegation at that time, had two very important influences. One of them was no death penalty. Sierra Leone and Rwanda wanted the death penalty because of all the crimes committed in those wars. I think the death penalty does not serve justice. It just serves a sense of vengeance. And for all sorts of personal reasons, some of you know my background. I spent a few times with people on death row, a year and a half in a prison with them. I'm serious. My roommate was a serial killer. And in the end, I found that there is something worthy, something noble in every soul. And there is redemption. And I can tell you, the serial killer I spent time with, I would never want to see out in free society again. But within the confines of a prison, there was redemption. Not necessarily religious, but human. And I've seen redemption from some of the worst war crimes, war criminals. And I welcome it, and I welcome the peace that those who have committed the worst of crimes may find in their own admission of responsibility and moving their lives beyond that. The other very important contribution of Bosnia was the idea of gender-based crimes. If you actually look at the Nuremberg trials, there was no one being tried for rape or sexual abuse. It's never happened. Rape was kind of considered a consequence of war, almost like boys will be boys. The winning side gets to take out the cheerleaders, even if they're not your team, and you get to rape them. And if they think it's rape, well, that's their problem. You're the winning side. We thought, after what happened in Bosnia, the mass rape camps, and something called enforced pregnancy, where Bosnian women were not only raped, but then impregnated, and then not allowed to leave, so they would have to bear those children. And the people who impregnated them said, now you will have to bear a served child. We thought it was important to empower the women. Not to empower them so they can have an abortion, but so they could make a choice. Some women did, in fact, have abortions. Some chose to have the child and give it away for adoption, and some chose to raise those children as their own. But the important thing is they had a choice. This choice actually troubled some delegations in Rome. It troubled the Vatican, it troubled some Catholic countries, it troubled some Wahhabi Muslim countries. And we found ourselves at a breaking point where these countries said, well, you know, maybe by labeling something as a gender-based crime, you are going to encourage women to use birth control, promiscuity, or God forbid, abortion. And I said, you're talking about, at that time, I brought together the delegations, everyone from the United States to New Zealand to Iran to Mexico to Argentina to the Vatican in one room. And I said, you're talking about the possibility of how this will be interpreted if something happens in the future, but we know how it's been done in Bosnia. And the experience of Bosnian women demands that women in future be empowered, that they are not only seen as victims, but that they are in fact seen as those who have a way to fight back. Now, there were a lot of people in Bosnia who said these women should never have these children because these are tainted children, genetically or otherwise. I don't agree with that. But then I'm not the one who has to bear the child. So now we have something called the International Criminal Court, and we have a few categories of crimes which are very relevant in places today, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, like Syria, like even a place like Myanmar, where there may be a genocide starting against the Rohingya and some Muslim-based groups. Trust me, if you think your religion is free of sin, then you don't really believe in God. If you think you're only victims, then you don't believe in God. Every religion has culpability, or the adherents of that religion have culpability on their hands, and every adherents of every religion have been victims. Which brings me really to the whole issue of justice versus the rule of law. Justice is subjective. It depends upon our own cultural, religious background. So if you look at the Middle East conflict, pick the time when you want to start to identify who's just and who's not, who's got God on his side and who doesn't.